Thoughts Matter. We discuss politics, paradigms, philosophies. We cover the thoughts and thinkers that impact our lives. You're about to watch a discussion that I had with Daniel Dodd. Daniel and I went to school together, and the topic that we chose for today can get pretty intense. So I hope you enjoy.
So, torture.
Torture. Fun topic, right?
Exactly. When is torture acceptable?
Is it ever acceptable? Is the other question.
It's a fair question.
So the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because I came across this back in college. I took a ethics course, and one of the main topics was torture. We had to write an essay on it and analyze whether it was moral. And I think we were analyzing a certain case, kind of one of those moral dilemmas, where they give you a terrorist with you know that he knows where the location of a bomb is.
Sure.
And I think it was based on a movie, but basically, you know that he knows where the bomb is, and is it appropriate to torture him in order to find out where the bomb is? And then extrapolate that to the bigger scenario of, is it okay to implement policies that allow for torture? Is waterboarding appropriate? All those kind of questions that we talk about when it comes to torture.
Right.
When are those appropriate? How are they appropriate? Are they ever appropriate? How does that relate to human rights?
Right.
Is it worth allowing policies that include torture, or would that be just too much on a international level, just allowing that in the United States, even where if we think we can implement it correctly, will that be too much of a blow to human rights internationally? So these are the questions that were posed to me.
Right.
And so I had to kind of wade through them and figure out exactly what I thought. And I will share that with you, but I want to hear some of your initial thoughts on some of those ideas.
Well, it certainly seems like a precedent has already been set in a way. In the States, we don't seem to have we don't allow for torture of people who are U.S. citizens. Mm-hmm. So that's a line that has not been crossed. But the debate is usually had in the arena where terrorists, like you mentioned, mm-hmm. folks from the Middle East or wherever who have posed a concrete and specific threat against American lives.
Right.
And that could be seen as an inconsistency on some level, where you're willing to waterboard somebody from another country but not your own. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing about torture is you especially interrogation type torture, because I think you can separate torture into two broad categories, where you have torture for no reason, like sadistic, just serial killer kind of stuff, and I don't think I put that into the same category, because with an interrogation type situation, you have intel for the purpose, hopefully, of saving lives that you're trying to get. So there is a genuine moral conundrum rather than just a desire to inflict harm. Right. So, and it's very much like one of those moral kind of dilemmas from everybody's college or high school ethics class, where you have to decide what level of harm am I going to inflict to prevent. So
kind of the utilitarian moral dilemma almost. So here's a question. Because in my readings, when I was reading what other philosophers thought about the issue, what other people had to say, a common trend was, yes, sometimes it might be from a utilitarian perspective, moral, or just from a situational perspective, moral, but from a policy level, it would be a terrible blow to human rights to allow for that sort of thing in policy. And so they would support someone making the decision to, I'm going to torture this person because I have to, against the law, but they don't think it's good to codify it. So what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, that strikes me as very similar to every episode of the TV show 24 that they ever filmed. It seems like that was the whole premise of that, was that Jack Bauer had to decide whether or not to tase somebody repeatedly to get the location of a sniper or a bomb or something similar. And it was clearly something that was contravening the law. I mean, this was on U.S. soil, and oftentimes they were people who were U.S. citizens, so it wouldn't have even been a Guantanamo type situation. So, but he did it, and then he was proved right at the end of the episode, in that he did end up saving hundreds or millions of lives in the case where they had the nuclear warhead that was going to hit L.A. or something, something along those lines. But I guess you really start to ask the questions a little bit more seriously and doubt yourself about the validity of torture. What if Jack Bauer had done something like that and then failed?
Sure.
Because even the utilitarian reasoning starts to break down a little bit there.
Well, because whenever you're dealing with utilitarian thinking, the idea being, pain and happiness, right? You're trying to balance them out.
Right.
Pain points versus happiness points.
Right.
There's always, it gets more complicated and impossible to actually calculate when you're dealing with potential pain or potential happiness, right? So versus certain pain or certain happiness. So here's a more pointed question. Is torture a human right issue?
I mean, it's written in the Constitution. I have a hard time avoiding that one. I mean, cruel and unusual punishment is something that's written out of the potential list of actions.
Right. No, I get that. And cruel and unusual is somewhat subjective. But okay. Here's my thinking in terms of...
So is punishment, too.
Yeah.
Torture, interrogation, torture is not necessarily a form of punishment so much as a information seeking. Yeah.
So torture is... I don't think that it's in a separate category from, when someone breaks into a house, robs a house, they are giving up certain rights, right? Sure. If someone breaks into a house, if they're caught, they give up their right to freedom, and in the sense that they should go to jail. If they break into your house and you have a gun and you fear for your life, or you don't see another way to incapacitate the person, whether you do or not, it's actually not on you to make that decision. If they break into your house, you have a gun.
States,
in at least in certain states, and I believe the way it should be, if they break into your house, they have forfeited their life to right. I mean, their right to life.
Because they have threatened your safety.
Exactly, they threaten your safety.
Yeah.
Same way, if I start to punch you, I forfeited my right to protection, my right to feel safe about myself, because you can retaliate, and you should, in self-defense.
Right.
So...
up to the point where the threat has been taken care of.
Exactly. And so, but that's the thing about human rights. Human rights are things that we all have, but we have also the ability to forfeit those rights.
That's true.
And I've always felt like torture was exactly the same sort of situation. So in the sense, especially if you're dealing with something that's so clear-cut, where you have a person who knows... he's even admitted that he knows where a bomb is, and you have the option of torturing him to find out where the bomb is, or trying other ways of getting it out of him. To me, it's what's the most effective way. That's all that matters, because that person's forfeited their right to anything up to life. I mean, they forfeited their right to freedom. They forfeited all of their rights at that point. So you have the right to do whatever you want to them in order to get that information out. And so my question would be, what's the most effective? And some people argue that torture isn't the most effective, and that's fine. But
that's kind of a more practical matter. But what do you think is the farthest you can go?
In terms of torture?
Yeah. So let's say that in terms of torture, I've also heard that this is not the case. I was looking at some leaked PDF from the CIA a couple of years back that had interrogation methods that include torture but are not limited to them. And don't use them as a primary method. But let's assume that torture is the most primary method. And the most dire pain you can inflict and severe ramifications for the person's physical mobility and health and well-being are the most effective way of getting something out of somebody. Should you be able to pull a Denzel Washington from Man on Fire and cut fingers off? Is that too far? Or is waterboarding too... again,
for me, it would come down to what's the most effective, and balancing the most effective with the most humane. I mean, there's no reason for undue, grotesqueness. You don't need to be inhumane for the sake of being inhumane.
Right.
And I think that you can inflict a lot of pain by sticking needles under the fingernails. There's a lot of ways to torture someone without even causing permanent damage.
Right.
Although that still isn't the question. The question to me is, what's the most effective?
Right.
The most effective with the least amount of potential... long-term pain or whatever, just the most humane. But again, from a human rights perspective, I think that in most cases where we talk about justifying torture, the person who's up for being tortured has already forfeited their rights.
Those rights are already gone.
The right to feel safe, the right to not have pain inflicted upon them. Those rights are gone. And so I kept on seeing this argument of to allow torture would be a huge blow to human rights worldwide. And I'm thinking, I just don't see it. I don't understand, because no one's talking about just torturing people for the sake of torturing people. It's in specific cases where people have forfeited their rights.
Sure.
So I don't see a reason why it shouldn't be handled like everything else. I think that it should be codified, and it should be very open. Sunlight's the best disinfectant. Let the judges handle it. Let the public know what's going on, rather than... it's much worse, in my opinion, to have something happening Black Ops style where the public doesn't know, and then because there's just no accountability. I would much rather have accountability from the people, knowledge is happening, and just handle it the same way we handle the death penalty, or even just regular punishment, putting someone in prison. I mean, these are things that we do because people have forfeited their rights. And we do them hopefully because they're effective in rehabilitation or whatever. We do them for usually for a practical reason. Sometimes it's just for justice. But torture, it's not in some separate category, in my opinion.
Well, hopefully torture is just for some immediate alleviation of a threat to other.
Yeah, torture I think should always be.
I don't think I would be willing to advocate torture as a form of
justice.
Punishment.
No, I don't.
I think we can all think of situations where we would love to see that happen on a visceral gut level, but like we mentioned with the Constitution earlier, cruel and unusual punishment rather than information procurement. That's getting into some really dicey territory. And granted, I'm sure you would lower the crime rate like nobody's business, but at what might cost?
Be effective. Right.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to sound unsympathetic or too dispassionate, but it is. I just don't think that it's I think it is something that evokes a visceral reaction.
Sure.
But I don't think that it needs to be a separate category of discussion. If that makes sense.
So do you think there should be some kind of boundary between policies that are used by the military and policies that are used by law enforcement that concern themselves with civilian and domestic affairs?
I don't know. I mean, I guess the reason why we don't torture civilians is because of the Constitution, because they're protected under the law from cruel and unusual punishments, and that's why there's sort of a difference there. But I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't see a reason why if there was a civilian in the United States who planted a bomb and was planning to blow up people, I don't see why they should be given any protections that aren't allowed to someone who is not a citizen.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question? Is that...
Pretty much. I mean, it seems like a situation that would come up more commonly with a member, somebody from Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda, because the bomb attack seems to be more prevalent from an overseas standpoint.
Sure.
You don't have a lot of people domestically setting off pipe bombs. And most of the crime in the U.S. is just gun violence in large city locations.
Statistically.
Yeah.
So, okay. And the other big question when it comes to torture is the harm that it does to the torturer. And this is another thing that I've read and I agree with. I think that there's a lot of danger, and this is what I would be most concerned with in a policy that allows torture, is the fact that the person who's doing the torturing can suffer a lot.
Right.
It really can mess with your head. I think about the Stanford prison experiment. Have you seen those videos?
With that.
Well, essentially, a psychologist conducted an experiment and just got paid some people to come in, maybe about 20 people, and he had half of them be prisoners and half of them be guards. Sure. And it was just this play acting, and the first few days were play acting, but then it was about a week-long experiment, I think. Maybe it was originally supposed to be longer. I think they actually ended up cutting it short. But by the third or fourth day, these guys are all totally into it. The guards are just being really brutal, unnecessarily so, and taking sadistic pleasure in it. Yeah. And it's just weird how quickly they started to just these roles started to flesh out and started to reveal some of, I guess, our evil nature. Sure. I don't know, but it's a very interesting experiment. So I see that, and I see certainly the potential to do a lot of harm to the person who is the torturer. Right. And so I guess that would be another reason why I certainly don't think it should be anything black ops, anything underneath the table. I think it should definitely be as open as possible. But what are your thoughts on how to mitigate that risk?
Well, I think the exposure and the accountability to the public, or at the very least to the legislature and the executive branches, is really essential. Because if you give somebody a green light, I mean, fictional universe, but I always think about the Bourne trilogy. the entire program was established on the basis that they can kill or torture or whatever it is without any kind of governmental oversight. So that's to me seems like a dangerous thing. And on the individual level, I could see some danger with the torturer, not only of harm inflicted to them emotionally or psychologically, but the other thing is you don't want to give that person a sense of entitlement towards the use of violence to other people.
Right.
And I think some people feel that anyway. That's the result of living in a world where that's another discussion.
That's probably why we get police brutality and
exactly,
and
or just crime in general. I mean, people have issues, but
yeah, absolutely.
I think you have to be careful not to encourage that, because the tendency when somebody gets power, I think, is to use it to its foremost extent. Yeah. So in ensuring that somebody cannot do so without consequences is really essential.
Yeah, and that's why I think, again, sunlight's the best disinfectant.
Yeah.
You have that accountability, at least for the legislature. When you can, open to the public, but at the very least, make sure you've got judges monitoring these things.
Sure.
If it's very top secret cases, still, there are people that can hold these government agencies accountable.
And that may be why it seems to be something that is only a conversation topic surrounding international affairs, just because I'm sure there are some top secret cases that are domestic, but there don't seem to be as many, to my knowledge.
Of course, if it's top secret.
If it's top secret, how do you know? The ninjas are good because we've never seen them.
That's right.
Yeah. Do you think there's a distinction between psychological and physiological torture? And is it important in interrogating people?
Again, my question is, what's most effective?
That's fair.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is a difference, and I think that
some
there
are both.
And again, I think the needles under the fingernails, that's a great technique.
Sure.
I think that would do that would work for a lot of things.
Sure.
I guess, and the psychological side of things is it can be possibly worse in some cases. I don't know exactly how that works, and that could mess with the torturer's mind even more. But yeah, I my question is just what works the most, and that's where people talk about waterboarding. People get waterboarded to prove that it is torture, or that it's not torture, that it's
right.
And it's like this. I think it's torture. I think you're inflicting pain on someone for the purpose of getting information out of them. I don't see a reason why that's not torture, but I also don't think that it's wrong. I think that if it's effective, then I think it's okay, given that someone has given up their right to not to safety, or to not have pain inflicted upon them. If they've given up that right, then I don't see why
there still does
seem
to be a pretty wide gulf between waterboarding and taking an arm off or a finger off with a machete.
I mean, there is definitely
just in terms of practical utility, getting information out of somebody. I mean,
waterboarding is pretty easy to set up. It's a relative.
Not to get too morbid, but you can prolong that and really ask people questions for a while. If you lop off an arm, there's only two. So
you only got one left.
Yeah, but
of course, I mean, in that case, might as well just do the whole bamboo underneath the the Korean or Chinese, I don't know, one of those where they strap you down with bamboo underneath and then just let it grow through your body. That would take a while.
I personally put in the situation where I have to torture somebody if there is a moral conundrum where there's a nuke in New York or whatever, and I have to torture some guy to get the location of the bomb. I personally would feel intensely uncomfortable with doing something that inflicts permanent damage.
Yeah.
I think I could waterboard somebody and still live with myself.
Right.
But think about some of the things ISIS has done, putting tires on people and setting them on fire. That's not necessarily interrogation type torture, but
you're not getting much information.
There's some really savage stuff that goes on in third world countries.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I don't know.
And that's again why
somewhere.
But that's where the accountability and the sunlight being the best disinfectant. Again, that's where it's so important, because it can get out of hand, or you could start seeing things that people it's like, we're not comfortable with that.
Right.
But I think that the more exposure you had, the more insight or oversight into whatever programs were using these methods, I think that would solve a lot of those issues.
That's fair.
Maybe not all of them. I mean, it needs to be codified. I think that there needs to be boundaries laid out in the laws. It's not just whatever the public opinion is.
Sure.
Cool. Well,
awesome.
Daniel,
good discussion.
So much for coming on.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching this video. If you'd like to support this content, please subscribe below.